Bueno, hoy tenemos el enorme placer de contar con la presencia de Philippe Sands en ocasión de la presentación de su último libro, publicado por la editorial Anagrama, Calle Londres 38, y va a estar acompañado por Martín Sivak, que es escritor, es periodista y doctor en Historia en América Latina. Voy a hacer una muy breve introducción de Philippe. Él es escritor, es abogado y profesor de Derecho Internacional en University College de Londres. Ha intervenido en destacados juicios internacionales en diversas cortes del mundo. Es también colaborador habitual de publicaciones como Financial Times, The Guardian, The New York Review of Books y comentarista para medios como CNN y BBC. Y ha publicado los libros Calle Este-Oeste, Ruta de Escape, La Última Colonia y Calle Londres 38, de reciente publicación. Bueno, les pedimos por favor si pueden apagar sus teléfonos celulares o ponerlos en modo vibrador. Les recordamos que hay traducción simultánea para los que lo precisen. La conversación va a ser en español y en inglés. Y les agradecemos a todos su presencia y sobre todo también a Martín y a Philippe por esta conversación que vamos a presenciar. Muchísimas gracias.
Buenas noches. Se está haciendo un silencio que es muy interesante, que es una de las grandes virtudes del libro de Philippe, que es esa capacidad para contar el universo de la justicia, de los jurados, los silencios, los carraspeos. A diferencia de cierta demanda actual de narrativas que busquen momentos de tensión, drama acelerados, Philippe consigue en el libro este silencio que se está produciendo acá en momentos absolutamente dramáticos, cuando la justicia británica estaba diciendo si iba a dar lugar a la extradición de Pinochet o no. Después de este silencio, me gustaría empezar, sí, formalmente con esta conversación que se va a centrar, por razones obvias, en el último. Sé que acá hay muchos admiradores de toda su obra, pero hoy vamos a hablar, entre los que me incluyo, de este último libro. Y después de esta conversación, Philippe va a firmar ejemplares y seguramente va a interactuar con quienes se acerquen a hablar con él. La primera pregunta que tengo tiene que ver con el título del libro, ¿no? Todo libro, de alguna manera, es la historia de un título. Vos trabajaste durante 10 años, hubo 22 borradores del libro, o sea, esto supone un gran trabajo y se nota esa transpiración, esa reflexión, esa exigencia, pero finalmente tuviste que elegir un título. Me gustaría conocer la historia del título, porque también tiene el eco de uno de tus libros clásicos, ¿no? Nuevamente la palabra calle está en el título, y acá sabemos que no es una fórmula efectista, sino es una decisión. Entonces me gustaría saber cómo llegaste a este título, o quizás si estuvo desde el comienzo.
Well, first off, I just want to say how incredibly nice it is to be with you on this stage in this fantastic city that I know quite well. To have a number of friends in the audience is very wonderful, and to be here in Argentina is very wonderful at Malba, a building I've visited and have been to see exhibits and previously done one event at, and it's really nice to be here. You're absolutely right, Martin. Titles are really important. This title reflects, in a sense, the epicenter of the book. What this book, in part, is about is the effort on my part to follow a hunch, and we'll no doubt come to it. Was there a relationship between Augusto Pinochet and Walter Rauff, the man who operated, designed, managed a series of vans that killed people in groups of 50 in Central and occupied Europe? That's what I was interested in. It's a double investigation of the circumstances of Pinochet's arrest and return in London, and the question of his relationship, if there was one, with Walter Rauff. And Calle Londres 38 is a building right in the center of Santiago, very close to La Moneda. Calle Londres is a wonderful street. It begins with a church, San Francisco Church, where today is it holds the Nobel Prize of the poet Gabriela Mistral, and then just 150 meters away is a building that used to be the Socialist Party headquarters and which from early 1974 served as the major torture center. But it is the title of the book because it was the first place that I found a connection between Pinochet and Rauff after the golpe of 1973. I met a man called Leon Gomez who was detained at Londres 38, and he told me that he was personally interrogated and tortured by Walter Rauff. So that is the reason for the title. I should say, since we're a literary event here, in English the title is 38 Londres Street, and it hasn't been hundreds of hours of work, but it's been a lot of work trying to find the right title in English. I wanted to call it Londres 38, and that was refused by my fabulous editor at Weidenfeld because she said people will think it's a book about the Second World War. Then we played around with different things. Then there was a complexity about using the word Londres in the title because the theory was English people will not buy books with a foreign word in the title. I mean, the thing about the English you have to understand, if the book has the word Nazi in the title or subtitle, sales increase by 50%. If the book has a foreign word in the title, sales decrease by 50%. That's the wonderful country that I'm from. And in the end, we settled on 38 Londres Street.
Bien, hay algo que como contabas que es muy relevante, que son estas historias que se cruzan, la historia de Pinochet y de Rauff. Vos ahí destacás 3 puntos de coincidencia, que ambos son responsables de matanzas, ambos enfrentan pedidos de extradición y un detalle, ambos son detenidos a las 11 de la noche. En tu pesquisa de Rauff también vuelve tu obra, porque esta pesquisa empieza de alguna manera con un libro anterior tuyo. ¿Cómo fue ese proceso de ver que este criminal de guerra nazi podía convertirse en un protagonista de un libro? Y más importante todavía, ¿cuán dificultosa fue la pesquisa? Porque en el libro se ve cómo vos vas descartando informes de la CIA erróneos, muchas versiones que parecen empujarte a ubicarlo en la colonia Dignidad, y vos finalmente siempre sos muy, pero muy cauteloso. ¿Cómo fue todo ese largo proceso de saber quién es este señor? Y después me gustaría también que cuentes tu encuentro con su nieto.
Well, we could spend 2 hours just on that question. I mean, where to begin? There's so much I can say in response. So the first thing you mentioned, coincidences, I should share with you that this is the subject of enormous marital strife at home, because my wife and I have a completely different take on coincidences. I think coincidences mean something. I think there is some other force at play that we don't understand that gives rise to what we call coincidences. The fact, for example, that my great-grandmother was born on East-West Street in this tiny town of Zholkiev, near Lviv, and that Hirsch Lauterpacht was born on East-West Street. And Hirsch Lauterpacht's son, Eli Lauterpacht, was my first teacher of international law. For me, is that just total coincidence? And I say, no, there's something else that is at play. And my wife says that's ridiculous. It's total coincidence. If you go to the cinema, she says, and you ask people to put their hand up, at least 4 people in the room will say they had a relative who comes from Zholkiev. So I'm not going to test it. I could test it, but I don't want to be proved that I'm wrong and she's right again. So I'm not going to test it. And I have to be careful what I say in relation to your main question. How was it to go through this experience? Because we're dealing here with really dark material. I mean, you've understood, you've read the whole book. We know a lot of what these 2 men did or are alleged to have done, and it is dark, dark, dark stuff. But against that background, and I say this in the context of the fullest respect for everyone who is on the receiving end, the actual experience of investigating, of writing, and of publishing is a wonderful experience, and I love it because I enjoy following my hunches and uncovering. And because, as some people in the audience know, I have a day job as a practicing lawyer whose task in many of the cases in which I am involved is providing evidence to support arguments that are made in court. So we lawyers are not good for very much, but we know how to find things. We know where to look. We know how to interpret documents and find gaps and deal with them. And so in a sense, I've just taken the work that I often do as a university professor or in cases before international courts and applied it in a different way. And our training allows us to take thousands of pages of documents and to digest them and then address them in ways that are useful, but also, and this I think is where I've learned a lot in the last 15 years, address that material in a way that makes people want to continue reading. I think one of the miracles of these books is that the material is complex and is dense, and yet so many people say once I started reading it, I couldn't stop reading it. And we can talk more about how I learned to do that in the context of a wonderful neighbor that I had where we live in London. But the simple point is, it's what I've done for 40 years, and it's what I love doing. In the case of Ralph, he was undone by a single document from May 1942, which named him in relation to the gas vans, and was used first at the Nuremberg trial and second at the trial of Adolf Eichmann, which caused him to be investigated by West German prosecutors and then caused an extradition request to be sent from West Germany to Chile, which led to the court proceedings that you've mentioned. And from that experience, Ralph took great care to make sure that his name did not appear in any documents. He knew what it meant to be named in a document. And in fact, in Chile as a whole, unlike Argentina, which went through a parallel experience, which of course was very connected, including in relation to the case that started in Spain and the role of Baltasar Garzón, who was investigating Argentina but was then sort of transferred over to do the Chile investigation. After the DINA was shut down in 1977, all the archives were destroyed on the orders of Manuel Contreras with the support of Augusto Pinochet. And so what that has meant is that when you're investigating what happened in Chile between 73 and 77, you proceed on the basis that there are no documents. And that means you have to talk to people, which means you have to come repeatedly, because you can't talk to someone in the same way over the internet as you can sitting in a room meeting them. And one of the people that I reached out to was Walter Ralph Jr. I mean, there's the main Walter Ralph, who's the subject of this book. Then there is one of his sons, who is also called Walter Ralph. And then there is, so that's Walter Ralph Jr. And then there is Walter Ralph Jr., who is the grandson. And when I first approached him, he was very wary. But he was curious. And I gave him a copy of Ruta de Escape, from which he was able to work out that I was not on a mission to be nasty to people. I was on a mission to tell a story and to uncover facts. And he saw that in Ruta de Escape, although I had differences with Horst Wächter, the son of Otto Wächter, I treated him incredibly respectfully and was never mean or nasty or challenged him. I let him say what he wanted to say, and that is the style that I've adopted. You can't just visit someone once. You have to see them a second time, a third time, a fourth time, and they only really start talking once there is trust. And you have to respect that trust, which means you have to honor what they say and provide the proper context and explanation of what they say, because they're going to read the book, and when they read the book, I want them to feel they've been treated honorably and decently. And so that trust was created, and it meant a lot to me that at the main launch event at UDP, the university in Santiago, just a week ago, well, just last Thursday, even less than a week ago, Walter Ralph Jr. came with his daughter, with Walter Ralph's granddaughter. That meant a lot to me, because it was a way of saying, whatever there is in this book, and some of which he will disagree with very strongly, I respect what you have done as an exercise. And so that is the way I've gone about things. And in writing this book, I've spent a lot of time with both sides. I spent a lot of time with Augusto Pinochet's lawyers. I've spent a lot of time with his principal lawyer, a man called Miguel Schweitzer, who I first met in Committee Room 4 in the House of Lords when I was sitting here and he was sitting there. And Miguel, I was counsel for Human Rights Watch. He was Augusto Pinochet's main lawyer throughout the entire 503 days. And Miguel Schweitzer said to me, he introduced himself, held his hand out. Miguel Schweitzer, Augusto Pinochet's human rights advisor, 1977 to 1984. And you can imagine what my reaction would be to that. But the funny thing was, we sat next to each other day after day, and it's a sort of Stockholm syndrome. Our politics are worlds apart. Our worldview is world apart. But we got on. I liked him. And the consequence of that was 20 years later, when I went to interview him for this book, on repeated occasions, he gave me unbelievable information because there was a relationship of trust. He knew I would treat him fairly. So the other side of the coin is that when you treat people fairly, it produces reactions. And one of the other people in this book who's very important to me and loves the book, nevertheless said I had been far too nice to Miguel Schweitzer. I had treated him and presented him too generously. And so you get critiques. But I think it's really important when you're writing a book and you interview people and they're giving you really important information, you have to treat them fairly and respectfully.
Sí, precisamente quería avanzar con algo muy destacado del libro, que es un libro que no pretende ser ni efectista ni estridente, pero al mismo tiempo tiene grandes revelaciones, y una de esas revelaciones es que a través de entrevistas consigue demostrar que hubo un acuerdo entre el gobierno del Reino Unido y el gobierno chileno, que hasta ahora no se conocía, y es el resultado de esas conversaciones. Entonces, para alguien que trabaja con semejante nivel de rigurosidad en los documentos, que los documentos han sido las fuentes, el libro finalmente, la historia oral, para decirlo en términos de los historiadores, son los que te dan dos revelaciones muy importantes. ¿Cómo administraste esa relación? Recién hablaste que se construyeron relaciones de confianza con estos entrevistados, pero ¿cómo fue llegar a ese punto donde pudiste confirmar este pacto que no era tan evidente hasta la salida de tu libro?
Well, when I arrived in Santiago last Thursday, I thought in relation to that part of the story, because there are other revelations in relation to Ralph, but in relation to the circumstances in which Augusto Pinochet came home early, shall we say, from London to Santiago, I thought there were only two revelations. The first revelation was that there was an agreement between the British and Chilean governments. In a sense, that's not a revelation, because everybody knew something had happened, but no one had ever provided the details. And what I've done is provided in graphic account the details. Second revelation that I thought was that in order to procure that agreement, the British were insistent on being provided with evidence that the Chilean authorities had enough material support to persuade the Supreme Court of Chile to remove Augusto Pinochet's immunity from the jurisdiction of the criminal courts of Chile. And the revelation in my book is that the head of the Chilean negotiating team flew to London with a document which was the order for the famous, infamous, notorious Caravana de la Muerte case, and it was personally signed by Augusto Pinochet. It was given to the British negotiator, and the British negotiator kept it. That is a revelation, because in Chile, no document bearing the signature or mosque of Augusto Pinochet has ever been found in relation to any of the acts of killing. No one in Chile was aware that such a document existed until the book was published. So that is a big reveal in Chile. But it turns out neither of those two things was the issue that last week caused a mini scandal. The mini scandal was caused by what turns out to be the third revelation, which is, and it is sort of delicious, the existence of a dossier of about 10 pages in length, prepared by somebody on behalf of the Chilean government and made available to Augusto Pinochet to allow him to learn how to pretend he was demented or gaga. And that is what has prompted a former Secretary General of the Secretary of the government of President Frey and former Foreign Minister, respectively Mrs. Sousa and Mr. Valdez, to put out a declaration on the day of my arrival in Chile to say that no one in the Chilean government was associated with such a dossier, knew about such a dossier, had any involvement in such a dossier. So, you know, I've learned how to interpret declarations and things, and it's usually much more interesting what they are silent about. No denial about a deal, no denial about the document. Instead, there is a distraction towards this other thing, which is sort of entertaining, but frankly, in my view, not as important. But of course, as I said in response, and I was discreet because I've undertaken not to reveal certain people's identities, I know who wrote the dossier. It definitely existed. And those who wrote the dossier simply could not have done it without authorization from the top. It's clear. And so I was asked about it a lot in Chile, how I reacted, and I just said it made me smile, because it seems also that one of those people, I did interview Mr. Insulza, and he must have forgotten that I had spent 2 hours with him and with my assistant, Montserrat Madariaga, and he had told me many, many things, including that there was a deal, including that the president of Chile had gone to the president of the Supreme Court and said, when Pinochet comes back, he will be stripped of his immunity. I mean, these are major, major issues. And that, of course, I take a very accurate account of what has passed and what has been said. So I can react pretty firmly to those kinds of things. It was Mr. Insulza who told me that the person I needed to speak to was Mr. Tolosa. And Mr. Tolosa was the completely unknown person who revealed to me the details of the agreement. He was the chief speechwriter for President Frey. He is a remarkable person. He trained as a psychologist, and he did his PhD in psychology at Exeter University. And he was selected, and there's a lesson here for people who are in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Argentina, because he was believed to understand how the British mind works, which I love it when he told me that. And he developed basically a three-pronged strategy, and the Chileans played the British. They were brilliant. The strategy was in three parts. One, do nothing until something really embarrassing happens for the British. When something embarrassing happens for the British, strike and take advantage of their embarrassment to offer a solution. Stage three, implement the solution. I mean, it is, these people are really, really smart. And it worked. And once I'd been given the full story by Christian Tolosa, which took 4 or 5 different meetings, in person, flying to Chile, spending time with him, building up. He had happily, he'd read, it is interesting how it works, he'd read at least one of my books, so he knew who I was, but more importantly, the lawyers in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Chile, where he works, had all read my books. And that helped build up his sense of trust that I would deal honestly and fairly with the information that he gave me. So he gave me the full details, I mean full granular detail. And he told me who his interlocutor was. And his interlocutor is a very significant person in British society. His name is Jonathan Powell. Jonathan Powell was Chief of Staff of Tony Blair for 10 years at 10 Downing Street, while Blair was Prime Minister. And Jonathan Powell is the architect of the Good Friday Agreement, which brought peace to Northern Ireland. He is a remarkable person. So I went to see Jonathan Powell, and Jonathan Powell confirmed 100% exactly what Christian Tolosa had said. And so I had the two main people who had never spoken to anybody giving me the full details. And why did they do it? Basically because they felt that after 25 years, one should call a spade and share what has come out. But the upshot of it is that we now know what the deal was, what the terms of the deal were, and how it was partially implemented, but imperfectly implemented.
Bien, hay algo que está en el centro del libro, que son crímenes horrorosos que han quedado impunes, y es uno de tus temas de trabajo. Me gustaría preguntarte cómo te llevas con la idea de la reparación. ¿Hay reparación posible? ¿La escritura es una reparación posible? con tus libros sentís que podés reparar algo, ¿qué es lo que podés reparar con tus libros?
So in this book, more than any other, I explore the relationship between law and literature. Law, legal writing and non-legal writing, a judgment and a book, an issue that I'm really fascinated about. I believe in justice, I believe in accountability, I believe in the rule of law. I'm not starry-eyed about any of those things. It's a long game. I'm very influenced by a colleague I had in my first years of teaching and being an academic at Cambridge University in the mid-1980s. I was a research fellow at a place called St. Catherine's College in Cambridge. We had a very distinguished colleague called John Baker, Sir John Baker, so it means very important, professor of English legal history. And as a 24-year-old, 25-year-old, it would be exciting when he would, every few weeks, invite me to lunch at high table and say, what are you working on? And I'd say, this is what I'm working on. And he'd sort of say, oh, yes, yes, that's very interesting. We had a similar problem in English law in 1472, and it took 273 years to sort it out. And that's sort of how it is with these issues of international criminality. We're right at the beginning of a project that is going to go well beyond us and well beyond our children and our children's children. It's just a long game, and so one's expectations have to be limited. One step forward, one step sideways, a step back, two steps forward. And that's how it is. And right now it's a very difficult moment, but I've got no doubt that moment will pass and we'll go into a different phase again. But what that means is that one thinks a lot about how justice is done, how accountability is done, how redress is done. And it's not just for the law and it's not just for courts. There are other ways of dealing with these issues. The essence, for me, in answering your question, is about our ability to tell stories. You can think of the law as a form of storytelling. A judgment, an arbitral award, is a way of telling a story about something, and it provides a service by operating in that way. But it's not the only way to tell stories about what people have done or not done. There are also processes like truth and reconciliation, and there are also other forms, films. Some of you will have seen recently the fantastic Chilean film Los Colonos about what happened in Patagonia with the Selknam, which does more graphically justice for the issue of the genocide of the Selknam than anything I've ever read. Or books like Roberto Bolaño's Nocturnos en Chile, which essentially tells the story of what happened with Michael Townley and Mariana Callejas and the killing of Carmelo Soria and various other things, but in a fictionalized way. And so I think each of these have a different function, but they relate and they interplay with each other. And that's one of the big themes of this book, how literature steps in where courts have failed to tread. And the interplay between that is completely fascinating. I had the incredible happiness of doing an event, a book event, with one of my favorite writers in the world, an Irish writer, I'm very partial to the Irish, called Colm Tóibín. And Colm Tóibín, I did it at Wimbledon Public Library, it was wonderful, it was about two of his books, Brooklyn and Long Island, in case anyone has not read them, go out and buy Brooklyn and Long Island because they're fantastic Irish novels. And after the event, he said, yeah, Philippe, I've read the PDF of 38 Londres Street. He said, it meant a lot to me. I said, oh yeah, why is that? He said, because I was in Argentina in the 1980s. I don't know how many people in the room know this. He said, I published a book called The Trial of the Generals in 1985. I went and sat in to the hearings. I said, you're kidding me. He said, no, I was a stringer for the Irish Times And I happened to be living in Buenos Aires, and I went every day to the trials, and I was amazed. And I was so amazed, he said, that not only did I write a non-fiction book about it, but I wrote a novel about it. My first novel is set in Argentina. I didn't know this about him. I'd not read that novel. You know the novel. I didn't know that. And I've, of course, now read the novel, and it's sort of, I understood why this book would have touched him and why he was so generous in commenting on it. There's an interplay between all of these things. At law school, we never learn about that, but there is in life. Books of literature and books of law and judgments all have an interconnection.
Bien, en el libro aparecen bastantes dimensiones de tu vida familiar, ¿sí? En el caso de Rolf, tu abuelo, una prima de tu madre, pero también aparece en otra dimensión muy distinta tu esposa, a quien está dedicado el libro. Y me gustaría leer esta parte porque también habla del punto de partida donde Philippe empieza el libro y donde lo termina. Es el momento donde le sugieren o le proponen informalmente participar de la defensa de Pinochet, a quien muchísimos años más tarde publica este libro. Entonces cuenta acá Philippe una conversación doméstica. La esposa pregunta: ¿lo harás?, me preguntó ella con voz firme. Yo le recordé que en el derecho anglosajón se conoce como el principio de la parada de taxi, la norma que obliga a los abogados a actuar como los taxistas, que tienen que llevar al pasajero que les toca en función del lugar que ocupan en la fila, sin rechazar a nadie por motivos políticos o de personalidad. ¿Lo harás?, volvió a preguntarme. Ya conoces la norma, así que sí, esa era mi intención. Bien, dijo en un tono irritado y dulce a la vez, pero si lo haces, me divorciaré de ti. El libro está dedicado a ella y en algún momento Philippe dice que llevan 27 años de feliz matrimonio. No te voy a preguntar por esos 27 años de feliz matrimonio, pero sí cómo resolviste esto, y algo me parece muy importante, sobre todo por los que hemos trabajado en la cuestión de la Operación Cóndor. Su suegro escribió un libro muy, pero muy importante, que es el libro sobre el asesinato del canciller de Allende, Letelier, en Washington, que se llama Un asesinato en el barrio de las Embajadas. Entonces tenemos a tu esposa y a tu suegro muy involucrados en este tema.
It's even worse than 27 years. It's 35 years. It was I mean, Natalia sort of saves me from myself. She has better judgment than I do. And I was able to get out of it because one of the wonders of English society is that with every rule there is a multitude of exceptions. And the exception was one called professional embarrassment. I had done an interview on the BBC World Service 5 days earlier with a journalist called Zainab Badawi, and she had pushed me on the question of whether General Pinochet should have immunity. And I said, we don't know. It's unprecedented. This has never happened before. In the whole history of humanity, never has a former head of state been arrested in another country for crimes committed far away, international crimes committed far away. But Zainab Badawi just persisted. And eventually she said, well, what do you think should happen? And I said on the BBC World Service, well, I can see the logic of an absolute immunity rule for a serving head of state, but I can't see it in relation to a former head of state. And she's, pushed me into basically saying he shouldn't have immunity for international crimes if the international crimes are established. And that allowed me to get out of the case. There are, a myriad of connections. Again, this is why we debate at home the question of coincidence or connection, because we have very different views about it. She's much more pragmatic about life. I'm more sort of spiritual about life. And it works pretty well between the two of us. But the connections are incredible. So her father was working with Orlando Letelier on a book. And a week before Letelier was murdered in Washington on DuPont Circle, blown up in his car, he had come to have lunch at the family apartment, which is still their home today. And Natalia remembered that. And she remembered it, she said, for two reasons. Firstly, she thought Orlando Letelier was incredibly handsome. And secondly, as she put it, he came up to me, I was 12 years old, and he told me I had beautiful freckles. And a 12-year-old girl doesn't forget that kind of thing. So these are, in a sense, the light coincidences, but of course there's the much bigger family coincidence. Most people think that the main Spanish actor in the arrest of Augusto Pinochet was Baltasar Garzón, the famous judge, but actually it really wasn't. He only got involved 4 days before the arrest of Augusto Pinochet, and I describe the circumstances in the book. The originator in the authorities of Spain was a man called Carlos Castrosana, who was a public prosecutor. And he had been visited by a number of Chilean refugees who were interested in whether he could bring a parallel case to the cases that had been brought against Argentinians. There were already cases proceeding against the Argentine leadership of the military dictatorship in Spain, but no case against Chile. So Castrosana looks into it and concludes that there is a legal basis to go against Pinochet, but he tells them, Spanish courts are very conservative. It would be better if you could find a victim who has Spanish nationality or dual Spanish and Chilean nationality. So they go away and they come back with 4 people. And Castrosana chooses one of those people. He tells me the name. I'd never heard of this person, Carmelo Soria. And Carmelo Soria had been the head of the UN office in Santiago. So he had diplomatic immunity as an international organization civil servant. He was abducted on the 14th of July 1976, and 2 days later his body was discovered in a canal in central Santiago. The authorities said he had been having a love affair, he got drunk, he drove into the canal. I mean, complete concoction. He was murdered by the DINA and the military. That is clearly established now. And that was the case which started the whole process for the arrest of Augusto Pinochet 2 or more years later. And the reason that he chose Soria is that Soria had a very famous grandfather who was an urban planner and has a street named after him in the center of Madrid, and I think maybe even a subway stop. And Carmelo Soria's brother, Arturo, was one of the early publishers of Pablo Neruda. So there was a real sense that this was a significant person. So I was interested in this, obviously, because I didn't know how actually the case had really started. And I describe it in detail in the book because I'm fascinated in how cases really start and the importance of individuals, which is one of the themes in my book. I think Carlos Castrosana has an absolutely central role, along with Juan Garces, of course, who was the lawyer the Spanish lawyer who had been an aide of Allende's in the Moneda Palace at the time that the palace was bombed. So we finish our Zoom conversation. It's during COVID. I happen to be staying with my beloved Spanish mother-in-law. Natalia's mum is Spanish, which is also relevant, I think, in terms of my interest in all of these things. And over lunch in the small Devon town of Totnes, the west of England, I tell her exactly what I've just told you. And my mother-in-law, Maria Elena de la Iglesia, says to me, what was the name of that bloke again? The one that Castrosana used to start the case? I said, Carmelo Soria. And she looks at me and says, ah, yes, of course, Primo Carmelo. And it was family. You can't invent that. In a very curious way, Calle Este-Oeste is the story of my inherited family, my relationship with my grandfather and his story, and Calle Londres 38 is the story of the family that I chose. My wife's family really is very directly implicated. Coincidence or something else? You'll have different views in the room. I know what my view is, and I know what Natalia's view is.
Me gustaría preguntarte por tu relación con Chile. En el libro contás que viajaste 6 o 7 veces. Subrayás tu condición de no solamente extranjero, sino de outsider, de alguien que viene de lejos, pero al mismo tiempo pasás mucho tiempo viajando, entendiendo el lugar y en esta sucesión de largas entrevistas. Me gustaría primero preguntarte por la recepción del libro y por tu decisión bastante infrecuente en el mundo editorial de un autor británico que decide publicar en Chile un libro y que sus primeras presentaciones sean en Chile. Hay una decisión que me parece muy significativa. Entonces me gustaría entender un poco más tu relación con Chile. Y llegaste hoy de Chile. ¿Qué ha pasado estos días que supongo que habrán sido conmocionantes, movidos para vos?
So in terms of the publication of the book, I mean, this is at its heart a Chilean story. My other books follow the normal way. You publish the book in English, and then a year later the foreign translations begin, French, German, Italian, Spanish, so on and so forth. But I felt that it was really important that the book come out first in Spanish. You can't write a book about Pinochet and Ralph and life in Chile and then expect the people who are most directly touched by it to wait for a year until a translation comes out. So we worked out an arrangement between my English publisher Weidenfeld and my Spanish publisher Anagrama. They were fantastic, they completely understood that we would publish first in Spanish on the 2nd of April last week, and then in English the next day on the 3rd of April. And I would do the first series of events in Chile, and of course being in Chile I wanted to come to Buenos Aires, which is a city I know well and have friends and have come to love. So the relationship with Chile is complex, actually. I mean, in the old days, I'd been for the first time in the early 1990s, and the people who sort of introduced me were, I didn't realize at the time, people who were exceptionally right-wing and sort of actually loved Pinochet and worked for him in many cases as foreign ministers or ambassadors or so on and so forth. There's someone in the front row who knows exactly who I'm talking about, who does get mentioned in the book, but I'm not going to mention him now, who I actually liked in many respects, but it meant that the circle of people that I met were of a particular view, so I didn't feel 100% entirely comfortable about them. But of course now over the years I've come to meet many more people from different sectors, and I've really come to love Chile. It's an extraordinary country. It's a very complex country. It's a very dark country. It's a very divided country. It's a highly literate country. One of the reasons I love Chile is I love the literature. And it has a generation of young writers who are just extraordinary. Alia Trabuca, Nona Fernandez, Galo Gigliotto, Rodrigo Rojas. I mean, really wonderful writers. And that sort of warms my heart a lot. It's been a really complex week being there this week. I'm very conscious of being an outsider. I'm very conscious of, in a sense, the feeling of humility that I've uncovered things that perhaps should have been uncovered locally. But I think there are many examples of situations where it takes the catalytic effect of an outsider to arrive and deal with certain things that are too delicate or too sensitive. We've just been through that experience in the United Kingdom. I mentioned earlier Jonathan Powell's role on the Good Friday Agreement. There's never been a lot of attention in my part of the United Kingdom on what happened in Northern Ireland. There's never been a profoundly big literature on the Troubles, as they are called in Northern Ireland, until the publication of a book called Say Nothing, which came out about 5 years ago, which I'm sure you know, by a wonderful American writer called Patrick Radden Keefe. And that book was catalytic. That book dealt with the disappearance of a single person, Jean McConville. I mean, there are only 4 or 5 disappeared. I say only because in Chile there are about 1,350, so it's on a different scale. But in Northern Ireland, the disappearance of those people is a really big issue. What exactly happened? And Patrick Radden Keefe gets to the heart of what happened. It's accompanied by also an extraordinarily good television series, a very rare thing when you get a book and a TV series that are really as good as each other in different ways. And so I was conscious of that, and people were pretty comfortable about that. In Santiago, most of the people who came, I think, were sympathetic to the kind of world values that I would have. Not everyone. And people who were on the sort of pro-Pinochet side would tend to steer pretty clear of these kinds of events because they don't want to be in the same room as some of the people who are going to be sympathetic to victims. And so their society is kept apart and separate. In fact, one of the journalists told me that he had written a piece and simply reporting what I had found and got more hate mail from that single piece than any other article he'd ever written from people who were pro-Pinochet, it's time to move on, don't talk about these things. So there is very plainly division. But then when we went south, it was extraordinary. I mean, it changed completely. I went to Punta Arenas and to Porvenir, and there the large audiences came for the launch events, and there they were very mixed audiences. They were, I was told, I didn't know them, but balanced in the sense of people from different sides of the political spectrum, interested to know what this foreigner had come up with. And that was very, very interesting. And I think also profoundly significant for me because people afterwards, while you're signing the book, want to tell you their stories and want to come up to you. And one story was particularly significant. I think books catalyze events. They catalyze talking and thinking about things in different ways. So at the event at Porvenir is a town of only about 2,000 people. So it was sort of amazing that 70 people or so turned up for the launch event. One of the people after the event came up to me. You'll know, but most of you won't know that part of the book that deals with a place called Dawson Island. And Dawson Island was the site of a special camp built for Allende's ministers and locals from Magallanes province who were on the left or opponents of Pinochet. It was a particularly nasty place. And there are so many rumors that Walter Rauff, who lived in nearby Punta Arenas, had been involved in the construction or operation of the camp at Dawson. I mean, literally everyone who was there would say, oh yeah, the old Nazi was involved in building it. So I looked and looked and looked, and there were lots and lots of rumors. But to be honest, I found absolutely nothing at all. There were no documents, and no one saw Rauff. No one said, yes, he was involved in Punta Arenas with the municipality in advising, and so on and so forth. So there's nothing there. You conclude there's nothing there. At Porvenir last Saturday, so just 3 or 4 days ago, after the event, a lady comes up to me and says, I had dinner with my grandmother last night, and we talked about the event today, and she said, yes, of course she knew and remembered Walter Rauff. Everybody in this small town knew Walter Rauff and how he spoke and was always with his dog. And she said, but I didn't just know him. She said, this is the grandmother speaking, on 5 occasions, I cooked special meals for him. He had important visitors. I did not know who they were, but he needed someone to prepare a good meal for the important visitors. I did that on 5 occasions, and on every one of those occasions, once it got dark, all of them left, including Ralph, and they flew to Dawson Island. So you get the sense, and you'll be aware of this in Argentina, as people in Northern Ireland and Rwanda and Yugoslavia know, there's a lot more stories below the surface that are ready or not to come out. And sometimes it just needs an outsider to come along and, prick in a certain sense and catalyze people's feelings of security about the whole situation. People are frightened to talk about these things because they fear retribution. In Valparaiso, on Monday morning, I did an event. Again, it was hugely attended, 200 people or something. And afterwards at the book signing, one of the men was holding the book. He hadn't read the book. He didn't know what was in the book. Told me he had been a detainee at Londres 38. And that was in June 1974. And then he said, and Walter Ralph was in the room while I was being interrogated and tortured. And he said, the thing was, Ralph wasn't personally involved in the torture. He just observed and watched. And that was really striking for me because that was what Leon Gomez had said in terms of Ralph's involvement. It was completely consistent, yet he hadn't read the book. So, of course, we're going to follow up on all these accounts. And that, I think, is important. Sometimes, yes, I mean, Christian Tolosa, I think, would not have talked to a Chilean. It was just easier to talk to someone who's from outside the community.
Me gustaría traer a una chilena desconocida para el gran público, pero que es importante en el libro, que se llama Prosperina. Prosperina, de hecho, fue a una de las presentaciones de tus libros y se acercó a hablarte. Y voy a leer esa conversación.
Just to be clear, so that you understand the context, it was 2-3 years ago in Valparaiso. They have a festival of literature called the Festival of Ideas. It was a room like this, large room, many people. I was in conversation with a Chilean journalist. Then there were questions from the audience. And the reason I did this, a conversation about Walter Ralph and Pinochet before the book had come out, is very often people turn up who maybe know something and maybe come and speak to you afterwards. And I wondered whether that might happen. And with questions, an elderly lady put her hand up and I pointed and said, and she then took the floor. And that was how I came to know Proserpina Fierro, a remarkable lady.
Prosperina, o escribís vos sobre ella, decís, me sostiene la mirada y me dice, perdón, primero Prosperina habla de Rolf, dice, era un hombre con dos caras. Por una parte, era dominante, siempre quería controlar el lugar donde estaba. Por otra, era un hombre amable y bueno, que era el que yo veía y el que me gustaba. Me sostiene la mirada, escribe Philippe, y me dice, yo supongo que tiene usted 3 caras, le dice a Philippe, la de escritor, la de abogado y la de alguien afectado personalmente por los errores que padeció su familia. ¿Puede usted separar esas caras? No sabemos si Prosperina leyó Calle Este-Oeste, pero hay una línea hermosa en ese libro en la que Philippe dice, como nieto, después de examinar los documentos, como nieto, pero como abogado al que le gusta ensuciarse las manos con la evidencia. Entonces, Prosperina trae algo como muy importante de tu vida, que es quién sos, el escritor, el abogado, la persona que sufrió, ¿Qué te hizo pensar ese encuentro? Porque de hecho lo elegís ubicar en un lugar muy importante del libro. Entonces, infiero que esa conversación te habrá en algún sentido estremecido, te habrá hecho reflexionar, y me gustaría que nos cuentes qué te pasa con eso, con que te veas una persona de tres caras, alguien que un rato antes habló de Roth como de dos caras, que obviamente no son comparables vos con Roth.
She is a remarkable lady. She was, it turned out, the first woman in Chile to get a PhD in electrical engineering. And she obtained a job at an American company in Brazil, but was then instructed by Augusto Pinochet that she could not leave the country because her services were too important. And so she was given a choice of jobs, and she ended up choosing, for reasons she never really understood, Punta Arenas. And she worked for a governmental naval company called ASMAR. And ASMAR happened to be next to the Pesquera Camello, where Walter Rauff worked. And as the only woman in the community of workers at ASMAR, when they were organizing a party, she was instructed as a female and as a junior person to go next door and obtain some scallop shells for decoration. And she described, one of the things I liked about her is she's basically a scientist. So there is a rigor in her words and in her observations. She goes next door to the Pesquera Camello. She's directed to where El Jefe works in the big warehouse. She's told he's up on your second floor, our first floor. So she goes up the stairs, and she says, I entered this vast room. It was quite dark. And at the end, I saw a table, a desk, a large desk. On either side of the table, a man standing, and next to the man, a Rottweiler dog on both sides. And on the table, a very large old typewriter. And behind the typewriter, the man I would come to know as Walter Rauff. It's incredibly graphic. It really opens up the imagination, so she has a power to tell stories. The other reason that I liked her and found her to be quite credible was it was plain that she was sympathetic, A, to Walter Rauff, and B, to Augusto Pinochet. So she wasn't in the business of being nasty about any of these people, which gave her account, I think, a greater weight and a greater authority. She was really giving a very personal and independent account that left a very big impression on me. And of course, I liked very much that she then turned on me and said, I came to this event in Valparaiso to see what you would say about a man that I knew and whether it was accurate and what your intentions were. And then I thought I wanted to meet you and speak to you, and that was how it began. There is, I think, another aspect here that is below the surface. We haven't touched upon it explicitly, but it's the issue of gender in all of this. It's very striking that a lot of the people you've touched on are female. And I think that's not a coincidence, nor is it a coincidence that the words of Proserpina Fierro, in a sense, end the book. I was saying to someone outside before that of all the literature on the famous Nuremberg trial, far and away, the finest accounts are by women who are able to capture in their observations what is going on, things in ways that men simply cannot do. Writers like, Rebecca West and Martha Gellhorn, and I was talking before about Sybil Bedford. And there is a gendered aspect in this book, in a sense. I find it very hard to imagine any conversation with a man following that path. I maybe also find it unlikely that a male would have done what Natalia did to me in relation to the case. And of course, the one person we haven't touched on is my favorite character in the entire book. You'll know immediately who it is, the interpreter, Jean Pateras. Just a simply extraordinary person, half Chilean, half English, who is the official interpreter for Scotland Yard, the Metropolitan Police, who gets a call at 8 o'clock on Friday the 16th of October, 1998, and told that she's needed at Scotland Yard. There is an arrest that is going to take place later that night, and the gentleman concerned does not speak English. So she toddles off to Scotland Yard. She's tried to inquire who it is, they won't tell her. She gets to Scotland Yard and is simply told it's somebody very important. She goes off with 4 officers from Scotland Yard, the Metropolitan Police extradition squad, to the London Clinic on Devonshire Place. They enter, they take the elevator to the 8th floor, and outside room 801 are 2 private Chilean security men who refuse to let them enter, and they are threatened with arrest if they do not make way, so they leave. They knock on the door. The general is in bed, asleep. Go in and wake him up, Jean is told. And a nurse goes in and wakes him up, and Jean is the first person to go in. And it is Jean Pateras who tells General Pinochet that he is under arrest for genocide, crimes against humanity, and mass murder. So you're in the presence of someone who has directly experienced that moment. That is almost like the most exciting thing imaginable. And of course, you've got 14,000 questions. Was he in his pajamas? How did he react? How did he react, Jean says. I'll tell you how he reacted. He sat bolt upright in bed, and he said, "I know the fucker who's behind this." That was the first thing he said. And of course he was right. It was Juan Garcés. He got it exactly right. Jean lived through the whole experience for 503 days. She was with him from the moment of arrest, and she wheels him to the plane in March 2000. So she observes everything. She observes him practicing that he's Gaga. Best example of that, she goes to the house in Wentworth to, with the police, they need to go and tell him something. And Pinochet stops her and says, "Jean, something incredible happened yesterday." "Oh yeah, what's that, General?" She says. She didn't like him. He said, "A lady came to see me last night. But the incredible thing is, I didn't know who she was. And they told me it was my wife, Lucia." So of course Jean just bursts out laughing and just says, "Come on, pull the other one." And it's very plain from the conversation that he knows that she knows what he's up to and what he's doing. And those kinds of accounts are absolutely priceless, coming from someone with absolute integrity and decency, and also a fantastic sense of humour. I do try to inject notes of humour into this book, but so after arresting Augusto Pinochet, Jean goes home in a state of heightened excitement. She calls her sister, who's living in Paris, because her sister's husband is the Costa Rican ambassador to France, so she's going to be up late back from some reception, and they talk about it. Then the next day, with the time difference, she waits, and she calls her mum in Chile much later the next day, by the time news has come out, and she says, and this is literally how she speaks, "Mummy, mummy, you're never going to believe what I did yesterday and what happened to me yesterday." And the mother says, "Jean, don't tell me you've been involved in the arrest of that wonderful man who made Chile great again. So, you know, just you need people like that. And again, it's sort of hard to imagine a male interpreter either going through that experience or telling you the story in that way. And so I think throughout the book, I mean, you'll form your own views, those of you who read it. There is a sort of female involvement that is really important, really observationally and substantively important. And I wanted to get that across in the book.
Bueno, lamentablemente hay una cuestión del tiempo y quedan unos pocos minutos. Me gustaría tocar un tema que aparece mucho en el libro, que lo acabas de mencionar, que es cómo la literatura chilena, o en el caso de Bolaño es chileno-mexicano, ¿qué era Bolaño? Pongamos una combinación de esas nacionalidades. Los libros de Bolaño, la ficción de Bolaño te despertaron el interés por distintos personajes de sus ficciones. Aparece Neruda, aparece Chatwin, el novelista y viajero británico, y nos acabamos de enterar en alguna de las entrevistas que diste que vos mismo estás escribiendo tu primera novela, lo que es sorprendente en el sentido de sos un gran referente de la no ficción. Tus libros tienen la virtud de que van a permanecer y se van a sostener en el tiempo, pero al mismo tiempo has decidido o estás planeando escribir tu primera ficción. Me gustaría saber qué te llevó a eso, si tiene que ver con lo que leíste para este libro, si tiene que ver con los límites de la no ficción, porque entiendo que la historia tiene que ver con unos documentos del periodo 41-45. Pero esta sería hablando de revelaciones, esta sería otra revelación, es que vas a escribir una novela. Y me gustaría entender cómo la estás pensando y por qué esa decisión.
It's very simple. It's a burning hatred of footnotes and endnotes. Just the idea of being liberated from having to provide evidence to support every single word you write is completely heavenly. But it is also terrifying because I think, I mean, there are other lawyers in the room, the endnotes and footnotes are like a sort of safety blanket. It's like a comfort blanket for a kid. It just makes us feel secure and safe, and somehow abandoning endnotes is both exciting and terrifying. Actually, the truth of it is, it will be my second novel. I have written a full, complete novel, which I have never shown to anyone, which actually is set in Argentina. It's set here in Buenos Aires, as some people will know. I got very interested in a woman called Victoria Ocampo, and I also was involved in a case at the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes that turned on the role of an Argentine naval officer known as the Angel of Death, who was involved and later became involved in a Mexican company. And I became fascinated in the story. I mean, that was about 15 years ago that I wrote that, but it wasn't right. And so it just remains in a drawer, stuck on my computer or something. But I think I want to try again. And I know the story that I want to do. It comes actually at the encouragement of two friends who are writers, both English. One is a crime writer called Ian Rankin. I don't know how much Ian Rankin is known in the Argentine world. And the other is an English novelist called Ali Smith, both of whom said, you write like a novelist and you should try writing again a novel. In fact, one of the things I love about being published in the Spanish language by Anagrama in Argentina and Chile and Spain is that you're described as a novelista. And like, that's much sexier than a non-fiction writer. That sort of makes me feel better about myself. And You know, like I'm in really illustrious company. I mean, it's non-fiction, but they publish it in their sort of novelista series, which of course in England would never happen, and in Germany and France would never happen. But I think it's that. I think that, I mean, the story that I want to write is about a single character who is very significant in my life, who I uncovered in Calle Este-Oeste, who is the woman who saved my mother's life. A woman called Elsie Tilney, an evangelical Christian missionary, who after bringing my mum as a one-year-old infant from Vienna to Paris in 1939, after the Germans occupied Paris, she was arrested and she was interned for 4 years at a place called Stalag 127 in the small French town of Vittel, which you will know, the place where they make mineral water. It's the same place. And I learned a lot of things about her life in Vittel over 4 years. And I sort of want to write about them without having to prove and support everything that I say. And my inspiration from this is someone I consider to be a truly great Spanish language writer, Javier Cercas, who I've had the great fortune of coming to know and has become a very good friend. He helped me a lot on Ruta de Escape. In fact, it was with Javier Cercas. Javier Cercas got me access to the hospital in the Vatican where Otto Wächter died, and we went together to see it for the first time. He's an extraordinarily generous person. He's a wonderful writer, and you'll know some of his books. One of my 10 favorite books is Soldiers of Salamis, which takes a real moment and then fictionalizes it. And of course, there is his book, The Imposter, which is just utterly brilliant, takes a real story and fictionalizes it. Now, he is a great writer. I don't put myself in that sort of camp, but he leads the way. He shows you how it's possible to take a true story and write an account that is based on truth, but allows itself to spread into the fictional account. I mean, this is one of the themes that I'm very interested in this book. It's the line between fiction and non-fiction. What is true and what is not true. What is imagined and what is real. And I don't believe there is a straight, hard line. Two of the books that are very important to me in writing this book is Bruce Chatwin's In Patagonia. I know Bruce Chatwin is hated in Argentina. Don't worry, you don't need to tell me that. I'm well aware of that fact. But it is a fascinating book. It's supposed to be non-fiction. I took it with me to Punta Arenas, looking for many of the people who were interviewed in his book, to discover that most of them never existed. He just made them up. And yet this is still sold as a book of non-fiction. On the other hand, you've got Roberto Bolaño's Nocturna in Chile, which is sold as a book of fiction, but it tells the story of the killing of Carmelo Soria in the Villa Naranja in the home of Mariana Callejas and Michael Townley as fiction. But in fact, it's completely true. The names are tweaked very slightly. Walter Ralph becomes Mr. Herr Rafe, but it's all based on true stories. Actually, it's a story that he nabbed from Pedro Lemebel, as I describe in the book. So this interplay between fact and fiction I'm completely fascinated about. Of course, Natalia says it's very dangerous what I'm doing because it will end up supporting people like Donald Trump. And there is something in that. So I have to tread very carefully, but yes, I think one needs constant new challenges in life. And it's just like a new challenge. And so that's why I'm going to do it. And I can get rid of the footnotes.
Bueno, lamentablemente se acabó el tiempo. Ha sido para todos los que te escuchamos un enorme privilegio escucharte. Así que muchas gracias. Y obviamente que el libro es un libro extraordinario. Ojalá que les guste tanto como a todos los que ya lo leímos. Y ahora Philippe va a firmar ejemplares y tener... no sé cuánto te gusta que te saquen fotos, pero seguramente habrá fotos o lo que sea. Así que, ¿dónde es? No sé, Sebastián. Acá sigue la conversación. Así que muchísimas gracias a todos y a Philippe.